choose like Mr. Mickle or Miss Patterson and just like talk to them about our progress and things like that. And they would give us some small suggestions, but it was still mostly on our own. Yeah, they were helpful.
Okay, hello everyone. My name's Kate. I'm a senior here, and my EE was about On the Road, which is a book that I'll be talking about, and specifically the expressions of masculinity explored in it. So it does fall under the literature category, and I kind of just wanted to talk about, before I started talking about the content of the paper, how I came about on this topic, because I know when I was younger in the program, or even before I joined, I think I even heard about like this daunting kind of thing. I definitely didn't really understand how people came to such specific topics. So specifically for me, I think for a very long time I was fortunate to know that I wanted to do a paper in literature. There was really nothing else that had come to mind before. But I didn't know what book or what type of investigation I wanted to do. The summer before my junior year, I read On the Road by Jack Kerouac for the first time, and it probably was one of the most life-changing experiences that I have ever had. It is an incredible book. Specifically for me, I just completely fell in love with the way it uses prose. It very much is like music. So sentences take up pages, and it's constantly moving. And I fell in love with kind of the world of the Beat Generation, so I'll talk about it a little bit more, but he was part of the 1950s, 60s movement called the Beat Generation that kind of spurred the counterculture of the 1960s. So it's Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, a lot of very influential figures of the latter half of the 20th century. And I was very fascinated by this world, but thinking more and more about it, I actually read a lot of Ginsberg's work and more of Kerouac's work as well. And I think it was a really interesting relationship that I started to kind of form with this group of people, because I loved them. I thought they were geniuses. I thought that their ideas were incredible, and they really revolutionized literature in a lot of ways. But I also didn't. I think one of the major kind of conflicts I had internally was, had I been part of their generation, had I been born in that time somehow in the same place that they were, they would never have taken me as a peer. The Beat Generation was extremely male-dominated and also very white male-dominated, and they explicitly kind of cut women and people of color off from their sphere. And that was a really interesting relationship to have with such people that I admired so much. And so whenever I decided to do a study on the road, I definitely wanted to talk about kind of at least some construction of those identities that I felt kind of excluded from in that sense. So actually at first I wanted to talk about the role of women in On the Road, but I quickly realized that that is basically a non-existent role. So that was fun. So I decided kind of on the other hand to talk about the contrast, which is the role of men and the performance of masculinity that the main characters kind of undergo throughout the novel. And I read it again the summer before my senior year, like I'm sure a lot of people did with whatever their projects were, thinking about the EE. So I read it again with not really any sort of thesis in mind. And that is kind of when I started thinking about gender roles in it. And then after deciding upon masculinity, I read it a third time through my senior year before I wrote the EE, finding passages, and kind of that was really when the analytical kind of specific parts came through. So that was kind of my process and how I came to this topic in general. So what is On the Road? I keep talking about this book. What is it? So this is Jack Kerouac right here. On the Road was published in 1957. Like I said, it was, Jack Kerouac was part of the Beat Generation. And the Beat Generation is very famous for being kind of like the spurring moments of counterculture. So it wasn't during like 1960s and 70s where, Woodstock, this kind of hippie culture was kind of thriving. But it was before that. It was right as suburban America was rising, and so it was a very direct and quick criticism of suburban America. Jack Kerouac's On the Road is the most kind of, I guess, poster child of the Beat Generation. It's the most famous book of the generation, most widely read, and also famously, it is, I think, the most stolen book from bookstores. Next to, I think, maybe the Bible, but it's always been kind of like a symbol of revolt and revolution and kind of this sense of going against something possibly oppressive. And it basically documents the journey of two men, Sal and Dean, who are actually just fictionalized names for Jack Kerouac and his muse best friend, Neil Cassidy. Neil Cassidy was a real human being. So they actually went on tons of trips together across America, like Sal and Dean. Jack Kerouac kept a very fat notebook full of all sorts of ideas that you can actually find in the Harry Ransom Center at UT. And he kind of wrote basically everything about that struck him during these travels, and later came home and decided to condense them. Famously wrote the book in 3 weeks on just coffee. And it has long been hailed as a liberation against post-war consumerist suburban America. So a lot of people who read it, it's very famously kind of hailed as the book of youth. A lot of teenagers love it, and he kind of coined a new way of writing that was based on music, on feeling, that really pushed the limits of syntax and character and time and plot. And so it was always very much seen as a liberating work, a work that was very progressive in the sense of literature and also in the social sense. But it was also something that was very exclusively masculine. So like I talked about briefly, it is very much the story of Sal and Dean and their male counterparts in their male circle, and their quest to find themselves, and also their quest to kind of become the idealizations of masculinity that they have. But all sorts of, there are women characters. Neil Dean has 3 wives over the course of the book, and Sal, Jack, also has multiple girlfriends, but again, they're very much used kind of as material goods, as goods in the background, and never as a character to be analyzed or to really be understood. So my question that I explored during my investigation was, to what extent does On the Road represent a resistance to ideas of American masculinity in the 1950s? So to understand that, we have to think about what is 1950s masculinity, and so this is kind of like my little history bit of the paper. So there were two very conflicting ideas of masculinity, that were coming about during this time period. So right after the war, it was kind of after this peak of masculinity. These soldiers had just come back fighting for their country. They had won the war. So the country was very much rallying for these young men. And right after they went to school, they were now pressured into kind of this suburban consumerist America, and that is where they met the breadwinner ideal that really became idealized and kind of still permeates into our culture right now. And that is the idea of the family suburban man, the man who works a 9-to-5 job, comes home, takes care of the family, and is providing economically for a suburban family. So while that was going on, there's this idealization of man in a consumerist space. There was also a great fear of feminization of men. And this is kind of deemed as a time of male panic. There's a lot of scholars who are like, that's an exaggeration. But one of the main kind of, I guess, physical and intellectual representations of this male panic was the Kinsey 1948 report. It's very, very famous. And basically it claimed, it's a very broad claim, but it claimed that 1/3 of American men have had one or more homosexual experiences in their lifetime. And this completely just turned the society berserk. Like, they did not know how to handle this type of information. Keep in mind, it was the late 40s. And I think, honestly, even now, that sort of claim would be very, very controversial in society. And so you see kind of like this fear of increased feminization of men, that men are coming coming into the domestic space, that men are coming to the family, that men are no longer kind of becoming like the male warriors, the male soldiers that have been idealized for so long. So On the Road is very much against this new idea of masculinity as a breadwinner, as a family man. It's very much about leaving the domesticized space. So Sal and Dean, the entire story really, they never have a home. Dean has a wife and multiple kids. The wives change and he has more kids as the book goes on. But every single time he leaves them, and if he comes back, it's just for just a meal or just to say hi. Actually, one time his wife kicks him out of the house, which is kind of the first time we see a reclamation of power from the woman in the book. And Dean and Sal also use women specifically for sexual pleasures. That's very explicitly told multiple times in the book. Whenever they meet a girl, Sal and Dean indicate interest of spending the night with them and then completely ditching them the next day. The women are very much described as like airheaded, dumb, not really wanting to talk about things of the soul, as Kerouac writes. And On the Road, what its main I guess, feature of this liberation from the domesticized space is, I claim that it is mobility. So the entire book is about them moving across America. They hitchhike multiple times. They are dirt poor and completely broke multiple times throughout the book. But what matters to them and what fuels them throughout the entire thing is the fact that they are still able to move. And so they constantly move from east to west, west to east, and then at one point they also go down to Mexico. But at first we see that Sal and Dean are aiming to get somewhere. So they'll be like, oh, I want to go to Denver. I want to go to San Francisco. Then they get to San Francisco, they're like, I hate San Francisco in like 3 days. I want to go to LA. So they go to LA, they're like, LA sucks, I want to go to New York. And so they're constantly moving back and forth, but something in them is convincing them that they still are seeking for a place. So they just replace that place with a bunch of different places. But eventually, towards the end of the book, especially when they start going to Mexico, we see that they're not seeking a place at all. They don't care where they go. It's just the fact that they're constantly moving that matters to them. So they don't have any aim of a location that they're trying to go to. They kind of stop at anywhere that's convenient and say hi to anyone that's there. And the only real relationship they have is with them two, themselves, and also the road. And so the road becomes completely their home. It becomes their idea of their space, which is also very masculine. And so here is one of the quotes that I used kind of to show how mobility is used as masculine freedom in the book. We all realized we were leaving confusion and nonsense behind and performing our one and noble function of the time, move. So again, it's constantly this movement that separates them from what they think are kind of the shackles of suburban American life. But even though we see this as a liberation of the 1950s masculinity, I argue that it is not a movement forward. It is not a progressive idealization of masculinity. It's actually a backwards one. So we see the idealization of old frontiersmen, ideals of kind of rugged, independent male family. So we see Francis Jackson Turner, I think is his name, his very famous frontier thesis that kind of fueled Manifest Destiny. That was about literally conquering land. I think that this is kind of like a reiteration of that idea, but instead there's no more land to conquer. America has completely gone coast to coast. So instead of conquering land, they decide to conquer cars, women, space, and instead the conquering is very much something that is mental and emotional and not physical in terms of fulfillment itself. And so we see these idealizations of characters that are idealizations of these ideas. So one of them is the hobo. And the hobo had a little different connotation in the 1950s than it does now. And back in the 1950s, the hobo was a very unique character that, in that it was usually a white man who had chosen a life of unemployment, or who had chosen, it was more of a deliberate choice than it is seen now, who had chosen a life of unemployment, or who had ended up in a life of unemployment and living on the streets, but enjoyed it in some way. And so for a lot of suburban white America at the time, it was a very big disgrace to them to have this kind of like idea of the hobo, because it was everything that they did not want to be. They wanted to be successful, they wanted to enjoy materialism, they wanted to enjoy the consumer society. But for Sal and Dean, this hobo who has chosen this lifestyle is an incredible representation of what masculinity could be and should be and was. And so one of them is Mississippi Gene. He's kind of like this very calm, old sage man who is taking care of a younger homeless person as well. So they're moving together. They are not like family. They're not blood related. But Mississippi Gene very much acts as like a paternal figure to the young boy, and that I think is kind of a representation of a new type of family that Kerouac envisions, where there are no women. There is no female figure. It is a paternal figure and a male son of some sorts. And he seems to say that is a more successful family dynamic than any sort of feminine influence could be. The same thing goes for old Dean Moriarty, who is never actually in the book, but basically he is Dean's father, who is a drunk and is constantly just kind of going around the country on trains and all this stuff. But even though he has obviously been a very absent father, probably had negative influence, on Dean's experience, he is very much idolized. I think Sal says at one point that sort of abandonment is what made Dean so impulsive, so ready to take on whatever was coming to him, and actually what made him so free and so masculine. And actually, that is my ultimate claim, is that the absolute ideal of masculinity in the novel is Dean Moriarty himself. So he is very much Sal's muse, Sal's aspirations, but also his best friend. He describes him as his soul, which I think is wrapped up in a fast car, a coast to reach, and a woman at the end of the road. So Dean is very much seen as like this incredible person whose soul is tied to the road and who doesn't really care for anything else than constant fulfillment in the moment, is very much stuck in the present. And Sal's kind of like clouded by this idealization of Dean at the beginning of the book, but towards the end we see that possible flaws are also explored. Sal gets sick in Mexico, and Dean abandons him to go travel again. And Sal definitely feels very hurt by this, and realizes that this constant movement actually leads to a lot of isolation, loneliness, a disconnection from other people, and possibly all this constant movement tied with masculinity. Their ideas of masculinity may also lead to the same loneliness, isolation, and disconnection from other people as well. So my conclusion at the end of my essay was basically that the ideas of masculinity and on the road turn against the Bright Runner epic, but it was not in any way revolutionary for American men. That it is very much not a progressive, but a regressive resistance to suburban society. They seek fulfillment not in the feminized home, not in their domestic space, but in mobility, in the masculine road, in a place where women do not exist, and where really, frankly, limitations do not exist, where they don't have to work, where they don't have to provide for anyone. That it is a reaffirmation of the frontier thesis. Like I said, they're not conquering physical land in the book, but they are conquering women, they are conquering cars, they are conquering emotional and mental space. And like I said just now, so I said at the end that it is not a progressive, but a regressive resistance in which they romanticize the past, and they romanticize the past ideas of masculinity through the road and through constant movement. And that was my Have any questions?
That was awesome. You already explained your process before, which was a very common question to us. But anyone else?
You put something on my reading list. I've actually never read it.
Yeah, you tried to deny it.
How much research did you do outside of like reading the book itself? Like, did you read other people's like reads or interpretations on it? Like, how did you come to know all of this?
Yeah, I actually read a lot of work. Jay Storrow was, again, my friend, as well as Mr. Flansburgh, who was my E supervisor, is actually extremely interested in the beads too. So I asked him for a lot of reference work, kind of based on John Kerouac and the beads. But I read a lot of work specifically about history, so a lot of things about what masculinity looked like in the 50s, and then also a lot of work about Kerouac's On the Road. But I think there's less work about the intersections of the two, and so it's kind of pulling from both and then piecing them together, rather than reading pieces that were kind of in the common space.
One question about not a progressive. What do you mean by progressive?
I kind of saw it as like, I guess a progressive would be new ideas of masculinity, so new ideas of what men should do, what men could be. And I said it was regressive because it was going back to old ideas of what men should be. So not, so the current ideas, current for them, 1950s ideas were that men should be in the family, that men should work. But in the past, and way before, when men were kind of explorers and seeking, especially the American idealization of men, seeking this new land and new places that had never been found before. The ideal then was more that men should be free, that men should not have any commitment to anything, that men should only be with men. And so this book was kind of a turn to those ideas, those very old ideas, rather than trying to create a new idea for men and separating from the suburban life.
That is probably adventurous, you can say, but is it progressive?
I mean, I don't think his ideas were. Are you saying his ideas?
I mean, you say the example that they're exploring outside.
Yeah.
That is, you can say adventurous, but is it progressive?
No. That's why I'm saying it's not progressive. So it's progressive.
It's going back to the frontier times where men were adventurers and they were outgoing with other men to seek new land, and whereas
And she's saying that was not progressive.
not progressive, or not following in the tradition of the 1950s where men were more often going into the domesticated spaces, right? Yeah.
Were you interested in Beat Generation? People read this book?
No, so it's covered in the English textbook for like 2 sentences.